It started as a normal Friday night. My parents had gone out for dinner, and I had the house to myself. I was looking forward to an evening of binging my favorite show and eating junk food. The first few hours were great. I had made a huge bowl of popcorn, curled up on the couch with a blanket, and settled in for a relaxing night. But everything changed a little after 9 p.m. I was halfway through an episode when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. I paused the show, the sound of the TV fading into silence, and listened carefully. I waited, holding my breath. Another knock followed, a bit louder this time. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the side of the house, near the kitchen. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would be knocking on the side of the house at this time of night? I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a branch tapping against the wall, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The knocks were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I took a deep breath, telling myself not to overreact. It was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I got up from the couch, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to keep my steps light and quiet. I peeked through the window above the sink, but it was pitch dark outside. The yard was a sea of shadows, barely illuminated by the light over the back porch. I couldn't see anything or anyone out there. I turned back to head to the living room when I heard a creaking sound, the unmistakable creak of the back gate. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me. Someone was definitely out there. I could feel my palms start to sweat as I stood there, frozen. I strained to hear any other noises, but everything had gone eerily silent. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter, holding it tightly as I opened the camera app, zooming in through the window, trying to get a better look at the yard. That's when I saw it. The gate was slightly ajar, swaying just a little in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I was sure we had closed it earlier. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My parents always told me to keep it locked. I could barely swallow the fear that was now crawling up my throat. I stood there, my heart pounding. When suddenly the light on the back porch flickered and went out, I let out a small gasp, the darkness swallowing up the yard completely. My mind was racing. I had to do something. But what? I could call my parents, but they were probably enjoying their night out. And what if I was just being paranoid? What if it really was just the wind? I decided to turn off all the lights inside the house. Maybe if whoever was out there saw the house go dark, they'd leave, thinking no one was home. I quickly flipped off the kitchen light, then darted into the living room to do the same. My fingers trembled as I worked, the silence of the house now feeling oppressive, almost suffocating. With the lights off, I crouched behind the couch, peeking just over the edge to keep an eye on the back door. I could feel every beat of my heart thudding in my ears, the adrenaline making my limbs tingle. It was so quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where you're afraid even your breathing will give you away. Minutes passed, and I started to relax a little. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe... Suddenly I heard it again. The knock. But this time, it wasn't at the side of the house. It was at the back door. Loud and deliberate. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The knocking stopped, and then I heard a scraping noise like someone was trying to open the door. My eyes went wide, my entire body tensing. I knew the back door was locked, but the sound made my blood run cold. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. I opened the messaging app and quickly texted my parents. I think someone's outside. I hit send, hoping they would see it soon, hoping they'd tell me what to do. But there was no immediate response. I sat there, my body pressed against the side of the couch, listening for any more sounds. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from the back door, around the side of the house. My stomach turned as I realized that they were heading toward the front door. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through me. I debated calling the police, my thumb hovering over the emergency number on my phone. The footsteps stopped and then the doorbell rang. The sound made me jump, a sharp jolt of terror shooting through me. It rang again, more insistent this time. I crawled over to the window beside the front door, keeping low, barely lifting the edge of the curtain to peek outside. My eyes scanned the porch, and there he was. A man, standing there, dressed in dark clothes, his hood pulled up. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking right at the window, right where I was peeking out. I quickly dropped the curtain, my breath catching in my throat. He saw me. He knew I was here. The doorbell rang again, followed by a loud bang. He was hitting the door now, trying to get in. Panic took over. I dialed 911, my voice coming out in a shaky whisper as I tried to explain what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, that help was on the way. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, tears welling up in my eyes. The banging stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. I strained to hear, my whole body trembling. Then I heard the sound of glass shattering, from the back of the house. He was trying to break in through the kitchen. I could hear the dispatcher telling me to stay calm, but it was hard. I was terrified, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I crawled away from the front door, trying to stay as quiet as possible, moving toward the stairs. I needed to hide. I needed to get somewhere safe until the police arrived. I crept up the stairs, every creak of the steps sounding impossibly loud. I could hear the man moving through the house now, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. He was inside. I made it to my room, slipping into the closet and closing the door behind me. I tried to steady my breathing, holding the phone close to my ear as the dispatcher reassured me that officers were only a few minutes away. It felt like an eternity. I could hear him downstairs, moving through the rooms, opening doors, searching. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he wouldn't come upstairs. The sound of sirens filled the air, and I felt a surge of hope. The man must have heard them too, because suddenly everything went quiet. I listened, holding my breath, and then I heard the sound of footsteps running, away from the house, through the back door. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me the police were there, that it was safe to come out. I waited until I heard the voices downstairs, the police officers calling out, announcing their presence. I finally opened the closet door, my legs shaky as I stepped out. I made my way downstairs, tears streaming down my face, as I saw the officers standing in the living room. One of them looked at me, giving me a reassuring nod. "You're safe now," he said. But even as he spoke, I knew I wouldn't feel safe in this house again, not for a long time. They say you get used to being home alone. After enough time, the creaks and groans of an empty house stop sounding like threats and start feeling like just another part of the background. I thought I had gotten there. My parents had been working late shifts for the past month, and I had spent plenty of evenings by myself, telling myself I was brave. But that night, something felt off right from the start. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Homework, maybe some leftover pasta for dinner, then off to bed. My friend Derek had offered to come over to hang out, but I turned him down, wanting just a little peace and quiet. I was tired, the kind of tired that made everything seem foggy. I kicked my shoes off, dumped my bag in the hallway, and decided a shower might help clear my head. I was halfway through rinsing the shampoo out of my hair when I heard it, a sound like someone pounding on the front door. Not knocking, but pounding, loud enough that I could hear it over the rush of the water. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly shut off the shower, standing still for a moment as I listened. The house was silent again. I grabbed a towel, wrapping it around myself as I stepped out, the air in the bathroom suddenly feeling colder. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer. I waited for a moment longer, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I imagined it, I thought, but my gut told me otherwise. I hurried to my room, threw on some clothes, and made my way downstairs. My bare feet were almost silent against the hardwood, and I paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening. The front door was still locked. I glanced out the window, but the front porch was empty. A heavy feeling settled in my chest, and I tried to ignore it, walking to the kitchen to grab some water. As I passed the back door, I glanced out, and that's when I saw it. The garden gate, swinging open in the wind. I knew for a fact I had locked it earlier. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I was just about to reach for my phone to call Derek when I heard something from upstairs. A soft shuffling, like footsteps moving across carpet. My stomach dropped and I turned, staring at the staircase. I could feel my body tensing, my feet rooted to the spot as I listened. The sound came again, closer now, like someone was moving down the hall toward the stairs. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy vase from the table by the door, and moved as quietly as I could, slipping into the coat closet beside the kitchen. I closed the door just enough to see out, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was silent again, but I could feel the fear crawling up my spine, my muscles aching from how tense I was. And then I saw him. A man, slowly making his way down the stairs. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he would hear it. I watched as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his head turning slightly as he looked around the living room. He took a step forward, and that's when I noticed what he was holding. A long, thin knife, the blade catching the faint light from the kitchen. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my hands gripping the vase so tightly my knuckles were white. He moved through the living room, his steps almost silent, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't know what to do. If I stayed in the closet, he might find me. If I ran, he'd definitely hear me. He paused in the middle of the room, his head tilting as if he was listening for something. I held my breath, my entire body trembling. Then, slowly, he turned and started walking toward the kitchen, toward me. I felt my heart stop, panic rising in my chest. I couldn't stay there. I had to move. I carefully set the vase down on the floor, my hands shaking, and glanced behind me. There was a door leading to the basement, just a few feet away. If I could make it there without him noticing. I waited until he took another step, his eyes focused on the counter, and then I moved. I slipped out of the closet, my bare feet making no sound as I reached the basement door. I opened it just enough to slip through, closing it softly behind me. I started down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dark, and I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers finally finding it and flicking it on. The single bulb in the ceiling flickered to life, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. I backed away from the stairs, my eyes never leaving the door. I could hear him moving around upstairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. My eyes scanned the basement, landing on an old storage cabinet in the corner. I hurried over, pulling the doors open and slipping inside, the wood creaking softly as I closed them. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The basement door creaked open, and I felt my entire body tense, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, each one slow and heavy. He was coming down. The light from the bulb was dim, but through the crack in the cabinet door, I could see his shadow stretching across the floor. He reached the bottom of the stairs, pausing for a moment before moving forward. I could see the knife in his hand, the blade catching the light as he moved. He was looking around, his head turning slowly as he scanned the basement. I pressed myself further back into the cabinet, my hand still over my mouth. I could feel the tears streaming down my face, my entire body shaking. He was getting closer, his footsteps echoing in the small space. He stopped in front of the cabinet, and I felt my heart stop. He reached out, his hand resting on the door, and I closed my eyes, praying he wouldn't open it. A loud crash came from upstairs, and he froze, his head snapping up. It was the front door. Someone had come in. I heard a voice, Derek's voice, calling my name, and I felt a surge of hope. The man hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and hurried back up the stairs, his footsteps quick and purposeful. I waited until I heard the basement door close, then slowly pushed the cabinet doors open, my body trembling as I stepped out. I could hear Derek upstairs, his voice frantic as he called for me. I ran to the stairs, taking them two at a time, and burst through the door, my eyes scanning the living room. Derek was standing by the front door, his eyes wide with fear. When he saw me, he let out a breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaky. I nodded and we turned, running out of the house and into the cold night. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the street, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The police came, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the house, found the back door wide open, the garden gate still swinging in the wind. They told us we were lucky, that it could have been much worse. I knew they were right, but the fear didn't go away. Even now, weeks later, I can still see his face, the way he moved through the house as if he belonged there. I haven't stayed home alone since. I don't know if I ever will again, because the truth is, it's not the creaks or the groans of an empty house that scare me anymore. It's the silence that tells me someone is there, moving just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. You know how they say you shouldn't watch horror movies when you're home alone? Yeah, well, I was never one to learn from other people's mistakes. It was one of those weekends where my parents were out of town, and they had put me in charge of the house. I had my dog, Max, for company, and figured I'd make it a movie night. Popcorn, a blanket, and, you guessed it, a good horror movie. Recipe for disaster, probably. But what could go wrong, right? Anyway, the night was going pretty well. The movie was doing its job, scaring me just enough, and Max was passed out on the floor, probably dreaming about chasing squirrels. I think it was around 11 p.m. when I first noticed something was off. It started with a strange, rhythmic noise coming from upstairs. I paused the movie, and there it was, a soft, repeated sound. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe the house settling. You know, all the classic excuses that people make in horror movies right before something terrible happens. But then it kept going. And Max, who up until that point had been snoring away, suddenly perked up. He was staring at the ceiling, his ears twitching, and I felt my stomach do a little flip. Max wasn't exactly the bravest dog, so when he started growling, I knew something was up. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, trying to act like I wasn't totally freaking out, and headed upstairs. The noise was louder up there. I followed it down the hallway to my parents' bedroom. Now, let me just say, I wasn't exactly thrilled about going in there. Their room was dark, and there was this weird, musty smell, like old wood or something. The kind of smell that makes you think of abandoned places and creepy basements. I shone the flashlight around, trying to see what was making the noise. And that's when I saw the attic door was slightly open. Now, I know what you're thinking. Just close it and get out of there, right? Trust me, I was thinking the exact same thing, but there was this rustling sound like fabric brushing against wood, and I couldn't help it. I aimed the flashlight up at the attic opening, and I swear, for just a split second, I saw something. A face, pale and still, staring down at me. I dropped the flashlight, my heart nearly jumping out of my chest. I didn't wait to pick it up. I bolted out of there, practically flying down the stairs. I ended up in the living room, my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Max was barking now, his attention glued to the staircase. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my parents, but of course it went straight to voicemail. Great. I was alone, with a dog who was freaking out, and possibly a face in the attic. This was not how I planned to spend my Friday night. Just as I was trying to decide what to do, I heard a noise coming from the back door. It was a knocking sound, calm, deliberate. I turned slowly, my eyes locking on the door at the far end of the kitchen. There was a small window in it, and I could see a silhouette through the glass. Someone was standing there. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I flipped on the porch light, and that's when I saw him. A man, standing on the porch wearing dark clothes. His face was pale, and he was staring right at me, his expression blank. He knocked again, just as calm as before. My stomach twisted, and I felt my hands start to shake. I made sure the door was locked and took a step back, my eyes never leaving his face. I grabbed my phone again and dialed 911, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what was happening. The operator told me to stay on the line, that help was on the way. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my eyes darting back to the door. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, until suddenly his head tilted to the side, as if he'd heard something behind me. A chill ran down my spine, and I slowly turned, looking toward the hallway. The house was quiet, but I could feel it, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, that makes your skin crawl. Max had stopped barking. His ears perked up, and he was staring down the hallway, his body tense. My heart was pounding, and I backed away from the door, moving toward the front of the house. Suddenly there was a soft laugh, barely audible, coming from the kitchen. I froze, my entire body going cold. I turned my head, and there, standing in the doorway, was a woman. Her hair was wild, her eyes wide, and she was smiling at me. This twisted, mocking grin that made my blood run cold. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice almost sing-song, like she was playing a game. I didn't answer. I just turned and ran. I grabbed the front door handle, yanked it open, and sprinted outside. The cold night air hit me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the driveway, across the street, until I was standing on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. I could still hear the operator on the phone, her voice urgent, asking if I was okay. "They're in the house," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There's 2 of them." The operator told me to stay put, that the police were almost there. I nodded, tears streaming down my face, as I looked back at the house. The front door was still open, but there was no sign of the man or the woman. The shadows in the house seemed to shift, and I backed away, my whole body trembling. It felt like forever before the flashing lights of the police car finally appeared. 2 officers got out, their hands on their weapons, and they moved quickly toward the house. One of them looked at me, giving me a reassuring nod before disappearing inside. I stood there, my arms wrapped around myself, trying to stop shaking. A few minutes later, one of the officers came back out, his face serious. He walked over to me, his eyes scanning the area. "We didn't find anyone," he said. "The house is empty." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "No," I whispered. "I saw them. There was a man at the door, and a woman. She was in the kitchen." The officer nodded, his expression softening. "We're going to check the area," he said. "But right now there's no sign of anyone. You're safe." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. Mrs. Lawson, my neighbor, came over then, wrapping her arm around my shoulders and leading me to her house. She didn't ask any questions, just gave me a warm blanket and a cup of tea, her presence comforting in the midst of the chaos. I stayed at Mrs. Lawson's that night, but I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of the wind had me on edge, my eyes darting to the windows, expecting to see that pale face staring back at me. The police never found anyone, and eventually they left, telling me to call if I saw anything suspicious. The next morning, I went back to my house, my parents arriving shortly after. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, like a bad dream that I couldn't quite shake. My parents were sympathetic, but I could tell they didn't really understand. How could they? They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen the look in that woman's eyes, the twisted smile on her lips. For weeks after, I felt like I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to shift and follow me. I stopped staying home alone, the fear too much to bear. Even now, months later, I still can't shake the feeling that they're out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I swear I can still hear it, those faint, deliberate footsteps upstairs, like they're reminding me they were real. I never considered myself the paranoid type, but that changed last night. It started when I got a weird text, an unknown number, just 2 words. Are you? I brushed it off as a wrong number, one of those spam messages, and deleted it without another thought. I went back to scrolling through my phone, lying on the couch, alone in the house. The clock on the wall read 10:15 p.m., and I figured I'd call it a night soon. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Same number. This time it said, "Are you alone?" I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. I could feel my heart rate pick up, a heavy, uncomfortable feeling settling in my chest. I typed out a response. "Who is this?" and hit send. No answer. Trying to shake off the unease, I stood up and locked the front door, then moved to the windows, making sure everything was secure. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't help myself. I peeked through a tiny gap, my eyes scanning the dark street outside. Nothing. The world looked empty, still. I told myself it was just some jerk playing a prank. I went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, my bare feet feeling cold on the tile floor. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped the glass. I hesitated before looking at it, and when I did, a shiver ran down my spine. The message read, "I see you." Panic started to set in. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I backed away from the counter, my eyes flicking around the room. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise amplified. I reached for the biggest kitchen knife I could find, my hands shaking as I held it. I wasn't going to just stand here and do nothing. I walked into the living room, knife in hand, my eyes darting to the windows, the door, the hallway. My phone buzzed again, and I almost didn't want to look, but I did. It was a photo. A photo of me, standing right there in the living room, holding the knife. I felt my stomach drop, my skin going cold. The angle, it was from outside, through the window. I spun around, my eyes locked on the living room window. The curtains were closed, but I could see a faint outline, a shape, just outside. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. I backed away slowly, trying to think, trying to stay calm. I needed to get out. I needed to run. I turned and bolted toward the back door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the backyard. The cold night air hit me, and I could feel the grass beneath my feet as I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the shed at the far end of the yard, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open and slipped inside. I closed it behind me, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shed was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the small, dusty window. I crouched down behind an old lawnmower, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I stared at the screen, waiting. The seconds stretching into eternity. Another buzz. My whole body tensed as I looked at the message. "You can't hide." Tears pricked at my eyes, fear clawing at my throat. I didn't know what to do. I tried calling the police, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. I was alone. Completely alone. I heard something then. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the grass outside. I held my breath, pressing myself further back against the wall, trying to make myself invisible. The footsteps stopped just outside the shed, and I could see the shadow of someone through the window. They were just standing there, not moving. I closed my eyes, my entire body trembling. The door creaked, and I opened my eyes just in time to see the handle turn, the door slowly opening. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, and I felt my heart stop. The person took a step inside, and I could see their face. A man, with a smile that made my blood run cold. I took another step, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden. I lunged forward, the knife in my hand, my fear turning into a desperate kind of courage. I swung the knife, and he stepped back, the smile never leaving his face. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, as if this had all been some kind of sick game. I stayed there, my whole body shaking, until I was sure he was gone. Then I ran. I ran out of the shed, across the yard, through the back door, locking it behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my room, the door barricaded with whatever I could find. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, the knife still in my hand, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the next message, the next sound. But it never came. The silence was worse. It felt like he was still there, somewhere, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. And even now, as the sun rises, I know this isn't over. Not really. Because I still have that last message on my phone, the one that came just as I locked myself in my room. The one that said, "See you soon." I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending the night alone. My parents were at a work event, and my older sister had gone to a friend's place. So, it was just me and the cat, Pepper, who was more interested in napping on the windowsill than providing any kind of moral support. I tried to convince myself that a quiet night could be fun, a chance to chill out, and maybe catch up on that book I'd been meaning to read. But honestly, I was mostly just trying not to freak myself out. The thing is, I live in an older house. You know, the kind with wooden floors that creak and groan every time you move. The kind where the wind makes strange whistling sounds, and sometimes you can swear you hear footsteps when there shouldn't be any. I tried to push all of that to the back of my mind and just focus on relaxing. It was around 9 p.m. when I decided to make some tea. I walked into the kitchen, flipping the light switch. Nothing. I frowned and flicked it again. Still nothing. Great, I thought. Just what I needed. The light in the kitchen was out. I sighed, trying not to let the unease creep in. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, setting it on the counter so I could still see what I was doing. Pepper followed me in, her eyes glowing in the dim light. I tried to convince myself it was all fine. A blown bulb, nothing more. Just as the kettle started to whistle, I heard something from upstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft thud, like something had fallen over. I paused, my hand hovering over the kettle. Pepper's ears perked up, and she stared at the ceiling. That was when the unease I'd been trying to ignore started turning into something more like genuine fear. I swallowed, telling myself it was probably just something shifting in my sister's room. She wasn't exactly known for her organizational skills. Maybe a pile of books had toppled over. I poured the hot water into my mug, trying to keep my hands steady, and walked back to the living room. I sat down, trying to lose myself in my book, but my eyes kept flicking toward the stairs. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, like I was just waiting for something else to happen. Pepper jumped up onto the arm of the chair, and I found myself absent-mindedly petting her, trying to calm both of us down. About 15 minutes later, there was another noise. This time, it was louder. It sounded like a door closing. Upstairs, somewhere down the hall. My heart skipped a beat, and Pepper jumped off the chair, her fur puffing up as she bolted toward the kitchen. My stomach twisted. I set my book down, standing up slowly. I grabbed my phone, the flashlight beam shaky as I aimed it toward the stairs. I tried to listen, but everything had gone silent again. "Okay, just relax," I whispered to myself, even though I wasn't feeling relaxed at all. I took a deep breath and made my way toward the stairs. Step by step, I climbed up, each one creaking under my weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from my phone. I moved slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears as I reached the top of the stairs. I stopped in front of my sister's room. The door was ajar, just a crack. I was pretty sure it had been opened wider earlier, but I couldn't be sure. I pushed it open all the way, my heart racing, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. It looked normal, messy, but normal. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a little silly for getting so worked up. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. My whole body went rigid, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The whisper came again, barely audible, but I could tell it was coming from the end of the hall. I turned, the flashlight beam shaking as I aimed it toward the hallway closet. My throat felt tight, fear gripping me as I slowly moved toward the door. I reached out with one hand, my fingers trembling as they touched the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, part of me wanting to turn and run down the stairs, to get out of the house and not look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I turned the knob, the door creaking open, the flashlight shining into the darkness of the closet. There was nothing there. Just some old coats, a few boxes, and Pepper. She was sitting there, staring at me with wide eyes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, feeling my body relax just a little. "Pepper, you scared the hell out of me," I whispered, reaching down to pick her up. But as I straightened up, holding Pepper in my arms, I heard something behind me. A soft, deliberate creak. The kind of creak that a floorboard makes when someone steps on it. My blood ran cold and I turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway. My eyes darted to my parents' bedroom door. It was closed now. I knew for a fact that it had been open earlier. I felt my heart start to race, my breathing shallow. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The house was silent again, but the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I backed away, holding Pepper tightly, my mind racing. I needed to get out. I turned and hurried down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my keys off the kitchen counter, my hands shaking as I unlocked the back door. I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I shut the door behind me, locking it, and backed away, my eyes still fixed on the house. Pepper squirmed in my arms, and I set her down, my whole body trembling as I pulled out my phone and dialed my sister. She picked up after a few rings, her voice groggy. "What's going on?" she asked, clearly confused. I think there's someone in the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I heard noises, and the doors, they were moving on their own. There was a pause, and then she sighed. "Okay, just stay outside. I'll call the cops. Don't go back in, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my eyes still fixed on the dark windows of the house. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, but I didn't care. I wasn't going back in there. Not until I knew it was safe. The police showed up about 10 minutes later, their lights flashing as they pulled into the driveway. They went inside, checking every room, every closet, every corner. They didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. One of the officers told me it was probably just my imagination that old houses make strange noises sometimes. I nodded, but I didn't believe him. I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd seen. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone was in there with me, watching me, moving just out of sight. I stayed at my sister's place that night, and for a few nights after that. It was a long time before I felt comfortable being alone in that house again. And even now, whenever I'm home by myself, I can't help but listen for those soft, deliberate creaks. The ones that let me know I'm not really alone. I used to think the scariest thing about being home alone was boredom. You know, the eerie silence, the creaks that always seem louder when no one's around. I'd never thought much about it until that one night. The night that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in my own home again. It started normally enough. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and my friend Alex was supposed to come over, but she canceled last minute. Something about her cousin visiting. So, it was just me and our cat, Whiskers, who had already curled up into a lazy ball of fur on the couch. I didn't mind it at first. A night to myself sounded kind of nice. I could binge watch whatever I wanted, eat whatever junk I had hidden in the pantry, and stay up as late as I liked. Around 9, I made myself a bowl of popcorn and settled in to watch some crime documentary I'd been meaning to catch up on. It was about halfway through, and I was just getting comfortable when I heard something. It was faint, but it sounded like a door shutting upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I muted the TV, straining to listen, the only sound now being the crunch of popcorn under my teeth. Whiskers didn't seem to care. He was still snoozing away, which made me think maybe I'd just imagined it. I was almost ready to convince myself it was nothing when I heard it again. A soft creak, followed by the muffled thud of footsteps. I froze, my eyes darting toward the ceiling. My parents' bedroom was directly above the living room, and the sound seemed to be coming from there. Whiskers was awake now, his ears perked up, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. My pulse quickened, and I set the bowl of popcorn down on the coffee table, trying to stay calm. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe a window left open, or even just the wind shifting something around. But deep down, I knew better. My gut was telling me something was wrong. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over Alex's number. I wanted to call her, ask her what I should do, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. Instead, I decided to just check it out, real quick, just to make sure everything was fine. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, taking a deep breath as I made my way to the stairs. The hallway was dark, and as I reached the top of the stairs, the air felt colder, heavier, somehow. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows, and walked slowly toward my parents' bedroom. The door was closed, which was odd. I was sure it had been open earlier. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I twisted the knob. The door swung open, revealing the room beyond. Everything looked normal. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn. But there was something off, a sense that I wasn't alone. I shone the flashlight around the room, my heart pounding. My eyes landed on the closet door. It was open just a crack, dark inside. I swallowed hard, my palms sweaty as I approached it. The door creaked as I pulled it open, the flashlight beam revealing nothing but clothes and shoes, just as it should be. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, feeling a small sense of relief. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. A whisper. My heart stopped, the flashlight beam shaking as I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was soft, almost like a breeze, but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from the far corner of the room, near the window. Slowly I turned, the flashlight illuminating the corner, and I froze. There, in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall, the face obscured by darkness, but I could see the faint glint of eyes staring at me. A smile spread across the shadow's face, a wide, unnatural smile that seemed to stretch too far. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My body felt paralyzed with fear. The figure took a step toward me, and the floor creaked beneath it. I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying me, and I ran. I ran out of the room, down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed down the stairs. I could hear the soft, deliberate footsteps behind me, following me, growing louder with every step. I burst into the living room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Whiskers was nowhere to be seen, and for a split second I felt a pang of fear for him. But I didn't have time to think. I needed to get out. I darted to the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The footsteps were on the stairs now, slow and steady, like the figure knew I had nowhere to go. I finally got the door open, stumbling out into the cold night air. I ran across the yard. my bare feet stinging against the gravel of the driveway, until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, my chest tight with fear, tears streaming down my face. The door opened, and Mrs. Thompson stood there, her eyes wide with surprise. "Please, someone's in my house," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't ask questions. She pulled me inside, closing the door behind me, and called the police. I sat there in her living room, wrapped in a blanket, my entire body shaking. I could still see that smile, the way it seemed to glow in the darkness, the eyes that never blinked. The police arrived a few minutes later, and I watched as they made their way across the yard, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They searched the house, every room, every corner, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably just a bad dream, that I was imagining things, but I knew better. Mrs. Thompson let me stay with her that night, and I didn't sleep at all. I kept replaying it over and over in my head, that moment when I saw the figure in the corner, the smile that seemed almost inhuman. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. The next morning, I went back to the house with my parents. They tried to comfort me, telling me it was just a scare, that there was no one there. But I could tell they were worried. They didn't like the idea of me being afraid in my own home. We walked through the house together, my dad checking every window, every lock, making sure everything was secure. When we reached my parents' bedroom, I hesitated, my eyes fixed on the closet. My mom gave me a reassuring smile, opening the door wide to show me there was nothing there. Just clothes, just shoes, nothing out of the ordinary. I let out a shaky breath, trying to believe it. But as we turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, just inside the closet, was a single footprint. A dark, muddy print that hadn't been there before. I felt my knees go weak, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked up at my parents, trying to find the words. They were already moving on, talking about something else, oblivious. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to scare them. But I knew, in that moment, that it wasn't over. Whoever or whatever had been in my house was still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and everyone else is asleep, I swear I can still hear it. The soft creak of footsteps, the whisper of a smile in the darkness, reminding me that I'm never really alone. It was a Tuesday night and I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and my little brother was staying at my aunt's. I was enjoying the solitude, something that didn't happen often in our usually noisy house. I had ordered pizza, sprawled out on the couch, and settled in for a movie marathon. The house was quiet, except for the sound of my TV, and the occasional thud of my dog, Max, moving from one room to another. It was around 10:30 p.m. when things started to change. I was halfway through my second movie when Max began growling. Not a full-on bark, but a low, rumbling growl that I'd never heard from him before. I paused the movie and turned my head to look at him. He was standing by the front door, his hackles up, staring at it with his teeth bared. My heart rate picked up a little, the sound of his growl setting me on edge. I got up, walking over to where he was standing. I listened for a moment, straining to hear whatever had him so worked up, but all I could hear was the wind outside. "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to soothe both Max and myself. He didn't stop growling though, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I hesitated for a moment before I locked the deadbolt on the door, just for some extra peace of mind. Max eventually stopped growling, but he wouldn't leave his spot by the door. He stayed there, staring, his ears perked up, as if he was waiting for something. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to the couch, pressing play on the remote. But I couldn't focus on the movie anymore. My eyes kept flicking over to the front door, to Max, who was still on high alert. The minutes ticked by, and I was just starting to relax again when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the movie. A creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. I froze, my eyes widening. It was coming from upstairs. I muted the TV, my breath catching in my throat as I listened. Max's ears twitched, and he let out a low whine, his eyes darting from the door to the stairs. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. The house was old, and it wasn't unusual for it to make noises, but this was different. It had been too deliberate, too much like a footstep. I slowly stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table, holding it tightly as I stared at the staircase. The upstairs was dark, the hallway light off, and I could barely see beyond the first few steps. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. Another creak, this time louder, like someone was shifting their weight. Max started barking, a sharp, frantic sound that made me jump. My heart was racing now, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. Someone was upstairs. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I run out of the house? My mind was spinning, 1,000 thoughts racing through my head. I decided to text my neighbor, Mrs. Lawson. She lived just across the street, and she'd always told me to let her know if I ever needed anything. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I typed out a quick message. I think someone's in my house. Can you come over? I hit send, my hands shaking. Max was still barking, his eyes fixed on the stairs. I backed away from the living room, moving toward the kitchen. I wanted to put some distance between myself and whoever was up there. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands trembling as I held it in front of me. The house felt too quiet, kind of quiet that made my ears ring. A moment later, my phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Lawson. On my way. Lock yourself in a room. I took a shaky breath, nodding to myself. I needed to hide, to get somewhere safe until she got here. I turned and hurried to the pantry, squeezing myself inside and closing the door as quietly as I could. It was cramped, the shelves pressing into my sides, but at least I was hidden. I held my breath, listening. The sound of footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway upstairs. They were getting closer to the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was up there would hear it. I clutched the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I could hear Max barking, his paws skittering across the floor as he moved toward the stairs. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and I felt a wave of pure terror crash over me. They started to descend, one step at a time, each creak echoing through the house. I bit down on my lip, trying to stay silent, trying not to make a sound. Max was going crazy now, barking and growling, and I prayed that whoever it was would get scared off by him, that they would leave. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and steady, until they reached the bottom of the stairs. I could hear Max barking, hear the growl in his throat as he stood his ground. There was a pause, and then I heard a voice, low, barely above a whisper. "Hey, buddy." My blood ran cold. Someone was talking to Max. I squeezed my eyes shut, my whole body trembling. I could hear Max's barking turn into a whine, hear his nails clicking on the floor as he backed away. The footsteps started again, moving through the living room, getting closer to the kitchen. I held my breath, my entire body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. The doorknob to the pantry rattled, and I felt my heart stop. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. The door shook again, harder this time, and I could hear the sound of someone breathing on the other side. I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks as I waited, the knife held uselessly in my trembling hand. And then suddenly, there was a loud bang, the sound of the front door crashing open. A voice shouted, and I recognized it as Mrs. Lawson. "Get out of here. The police are on their way." There was a scramble, the sound of footsteps retreating, and then the back door slammed open. I heard Max barking again, the sound of his paws thundering after whoever it was as they ran out of the house. I stayed where I was, my whole body shaking, until I heard Mrs. Lawson's voice calling my name. I slowly opened the pantry door, my legs feeling like jelly as I stepped out. Mrs. Lawson was standing in the kitchen, a baseball bat in her hands, her face flushed with adrenaline. She looked at me, her eyes softening. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now," she said, her voice gentle. I nodded, but I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe again. The police arrived a few minutes later, taking my statement, checking the house. They found the back door wide open, the lock broken. There was no sign of the man who had been in my house, and they told me it was likely he had fled the neighborhood. That night, I stayed at Mrs. Lawson's. I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house, not after what had happened. Even now, weeks later, I still get chills thinking about it. The way Max had growled at the door, the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps, the whisper of that man's voice. I've always loved being home alone, but after that night, it's different. The quiet that I used to enjoy now feels oppressive, every creak of the house making my heart skip a beat. I keep the doors locked, the windows closed, and I never ignore Max when he growls, because I know now that sometimes the fear you feel isn't just in your head. Sometimes the danger is real, closer than you'd ever want to believe. You know, I always thought the whole "I'm being watched" feeling was just a weird trick my brain played on me when I was alone. Like your imagination goes wild, and suddenly every shadow has eyes. But then last Thursday happened, and now I'm not so sure anymore. My parents were away on a trip, and I had the house to myself for the next few days. I figured it'd be a good time to catch up on some much-needed me time. Video games, junk food, maybe even an early night for once. Everything was fine until about 8 p.m. I was in the middle of a game, losing pretty badly, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the doorbell camera. Someone was at the door. I glanced over at my phone, half expecting it to be a package delivery I'd forgotten about, but the screen showed a person, a man, standing there. He was looking straight into the camera, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. The weird part was, he wasn't ringing the bell. He was just standing there, staring. I paused the game, suddenly feeling a lot more awake. Who just stands at someone's door without ringing the bell? I watched him for a few more seconds, my thumb hovering over the talk button on the app. But before I could press it, he turned and walked away, disappearing out of view. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, trying to brush it off. Maybe he had the wrong house. Maybe it was just a weird mistake. I went back to my game, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every few minutes, I'd glance at my phone, checking the doorbell app just to make sure he hadn't come back. And then about an hour later, I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The blinds were drawn, and I couldn't see outside, but I knew the sound was coming from the window in the living room. I slowly put the controller down, my eyes fixed on the blinds. Another tap, louder this time. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I reached for my phone, opening the camera feed again. The front porch was empty, but something in my gut told me whoever had been there earlier wasn't done yet. I stood up, my legs feeling shaky, and crept over to the window. I moved the blinds just enough to peek out, and my stomach dropped. There he was, the same man, standing just a few feet away, staring at the window. He must have seen the movement of the blinds, because his head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he smiled. This strange, too wide smile that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I fumbled for the lock on the window, double-checking it was secure before grabbing my phone again. I dialed Derek's number, my hands trembling as I waited for him to pick up. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy, like he'd just woken up from a nap. "Hey man, what's up?" he asked, yawning. "Someone's outside," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He was at the door earlier, and now he's at the window. I don't know what to do." Derek was quiet for a second. Then I heard the rustling of blankets. "Okay, listen. Just stay calm. Do you want me to come over?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, please, just hurry. I'll be there in 10, he said, and hung up. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. 10 minutes. I just had to make it 10 minutes. I glanced back at the window, but the man was gone. I moved away, heading to the kitchen to grab a knife. Something. Anything to make me feel less helpless. I was standing there trying to keep my breathing steady when I heard a noise from the back of the house. It was the sound of the sliding glass door, the one leading to the patio, moving, like someone was trying to force it open. Panic surged through me, and I ran to the hallway, ducking into the small closet under the stairs. I closed the door, my entire body trembling as I pressed myself against the back wall. I could hear the door now, the glass rattling in its frame, followed by a soft, almost casual click. My blood ran cold. He'd gotten it open. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying not to make a sound, every muscle in my body tense. The house was silent again, and then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body shaking. The footsteps moved closer, and I could hear him breathing, this low, steady sound that made my skin crawl. He was in the hallway now, just a few feet away from where I was hiding. I could see his shadow through the crack under the door, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't open it. The seconds felt like hours, and then finally, I heard it. The sound of Derek's car pulling up, the engine rumbling loudly in the quiet night. The footsteps paused, and I watched as the shadow shifted, then moved away, back toward the kitchen. I heard the sliding door again, the soft scrape of it opening and closing, and then silence. I waited, my entire body trembling, until I heard Derek's voice calling my name. I pushed the closet door open, stumbling out into the hallway. Derek was standing in the kitchen, his eyes wide with concern. When he saw me, he let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing a little. "He's gone," I said, my voice shaky. "He was in the house, but he's gone now." Derek nodded, glancing toward the sliding door. "Let's get out of here. You can stay at my place tonight." I didn't argue. I just grabbed my keys and followed him out, my heart still pounding in my chest. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the house, half expecting to see that man standing there, watching us leave. The police came later, took my statement, checked the house, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They told me it was probably just some guy messing around, that it was nothing to worry about. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in his eyes, the smile on his face. He wasn't just messing around. He knew exactly what he was doing. And now, even weeks later, I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it, the soft tap, tap, tap at the window, and I know he hasn't forgotten me.